My children, it's November 17th, and Graham, our neighbor, is outside sawing and hammering on stuff, so you might be able to hear him working in the background. Today I'm going to read to you from one of our favorite authors, James Herriot. And as you know, on our shelf here at home, we have a collection of dog stories, short stories. So I'm going to read one, an old favorite, called Abandoned. It's a little sad, I'm sorry, but it ends happy. You often see dogs running along a road, but there was something about this one which made me slow down and take a second look. It was a small brown animal. It was approaching on the other side, and it wasn't just ambling by the grass verge, but galloping all out in its short legs, head extended forward, as though in desperate pursuit of something unseen beyond the empty curve of tarmac ahead. As the dog passed, I had a brief glimpse of 2 staring eyes and a lolling tongue. Then he was gone. My car stalled and lurched to a halt, but I sat unheeded, still gazing into the mirror at the small form receding rapidly until it was almost invisible against the browns and greens of the surrounding moor. As I switched on the engine, I had difficulty in dragging my thoughts back to the job at hand, because I had seen something chilling there, a momentary but vivid expression of frantic effort, despair, blind terror. And driving away, the image stayed with me. Where had that dog come from? There were no roadside farms on this high, lonely byway, not a parked car anywhere. And in any case, he wasn't just casually going. Somewhere, there was a frenzied urgency in his every movement. It was no good. I had to find out. I backed off the unfenced road among the sparse turfs and heather and turned back in the direction I'd come. I had to drive a surprisingly long way before I saw the little animal, still beating his solitary way. And at the sound of the approaching car, he halted, stared for a moment, then trotted on again. But his laboring limbs told me he was near exhaustion, and I pulled up 20 yards ahead of him, got out and waited. He made no protest as I knelt on the roadside turf and caught him gently as he came up to me. He was a border terrier, and after another quick glance at the car, his eyes took on a terrified light as he looked again at the empty road ahead. He wasn't wearing a collar, but there was a ring of flattened hair on his neck, as though one had recently been removed. I opened his mouth and looked at his teeth. He wasn't very old, maybe around 2 or 3. There were rolls of fat along the ribs, so he hadn't been starved. I was examining his skin when suddenly the wide, panting mouth closed, and the whole body stiffened as another car approached. For a moment he stared at it with fierce hope, but when the vehicle flashed by, he sagged and began to pant again. So that was it. He had been dumped. Some time ago, the humans he loved and trusted had opened their car door, hurled him out into the unknown world, and driven merrily away. I began to feel sick, physically sick, and a murderous rage flowed through me. Had they laughed, I wondered, these people, at the idea of the bewildered little creature toiling vainly behind them? I passed my hand over the rough hairs of his head. I could forgive anybody for robbing a bank, but never for this. "Come on, fella," I said, lifting him gently. "You're coming home with me." Sam was used to strange dogs in the car, and he sniffed incuriously at the newcomer. The terrier huddled on the passenger seat, trembling violently, and I kept my hand on him as I drove. Back in our bedsitter, Helen pushed a bowl of meat and biscuits under his nose, but the little animal showed no interest. "How could anybody do this?" she murmured. "And anyway, why? What reason could they have?" I stroked the head again. "Oh, you'd be surprised at some of the reasons. They do it because a dog turns savage, but that can't be so in this case. I had seen enough dogs to interpret the warm, friendly light behind the fear in those eyes, and the way the terrier had submitted unquestionably as I prized unquestionably as I prized his mouth open, lifted him, handled him, all pointed to one thing: he was a docile little creature. Or sometimes, I continued, they dump dogs just because they're tired of them. They got them when they were charming puppies and have no interest in them when they grow up, or maybe the license is due to be paid. That's a good enough reason for some people to take a drive into the country and push their pets out into the unknown. I didn't say any more. There was quite a long list of why. Should I depress Helen with tales of the other times when I had seen it happen? People moving to another house where they couldn't keep a dog, a baby arriving and claiming all the attention and affection, and dogs were occasionally abandoned when a more glamorous pet succeeded them. I looked at the little terrier. This was the sort of thing which could have happened to him. A big dashing Alsatian, an eye-catching sulky. Anything like that would take over effortlessly from a rather roly-poly border terrier with some people. I'd seen it in the past. A little fellow was definitely running to fat despite his comparative youth. In fact, he had been running back there. In fact, when he had been running back there, his legs splayed out from his shoulders. That was another clue. It was possible he had spent most of his time indoors without exercise. Anyways, I was only guessing. I rang the police. No reports of a lost dog in the district. I hadn't really expected any. During the evening, we did our best to comfort the terrier, but he lay trembling, his head on his paws, his eyes closed. The only time he showed interest was when a car passed along the street outside. Then he would raise his head, listen, ears pricked, for a few seconds, till the sound died away. Helen hoisted him onto her lap and held him there for over an hour, but he was too deeply sunk in misery to respond to her caresses and soft words. I finally decided it would be the best thing to sedate him and give him a shot of morphine. When we went to bed, he was stretched out soundly asleep in Sam's basket, with Sam himself curled up philosophically on the rug by his side. Next morning, he was still unhappy, but sufficiently recovered to look around him and take stock. When I went up and spoke to him, he rolled over on his back, not playfully, but almost automatically, as though it was normal mannerism. I bent and rubbed his chest while he looked up at me non-committally. I like dogs which rolled over like this. They were usually good-natured, and it was a gesture of trust. "That's better, old lad," I said. "Come on, cheer up." For a moment his mouth widened. He had a comical little monkey face, and briefly it seemed to be split by a huge grin, making him look extraordinarily attractive. Helen spoke over my shoulder. "He's a lovely little dog, Jim. He's so appealing. I could really get fond of him." Yes, that was the trouble. So could I. I could get too fond of all the unwanted animals which passed through our hands. Not just the abandoned ones, but the dogs which came in for euthanasia with the traumatic addendum, unless you can find him a home. That put the pressure on me. Putting an animal to sleep when he was incurably ill, in pain, or so old that life had lost its savor was something I could tolerate. In fact, often it seemed as though I were doing the suffering creature a favor. But when a young, healthy, charming animal was involved, it was a harrowing business. What does a vet do in these circumstances? Refuse and send the owner away, with the lurking knowledge that the man might go round to the chemist and buy a dose of poison? That was far worse than the humane, painless barbiturate. One thing a vet can't do is take in all these animals himself. If I'd given away to all my impulses, I would have accumulated a positive menagerie by now. It was a hell of a problem which had to always be troubled. It was a hell of a problem which had always troubled me, and now I had the soft-hearted wife which made the pull twice as strong. I turned to her now and voiced my thoughts. Helen, we can't keep him, you know. One dog in a bedsitter is enough. I didn't add that we ourselves probably would not be in the bedsitter much longer. That was another thing I didn't want to bring up. She nodded. I suppose so, but I have the feeling that this is one of the sweetest little dogs I've seen for a long time. When he gets over his fear, I mean. What on earth can we do with him? Well, he's a stray, I bent again and rubbed the rough hair on the chest, so he should really go to the kennels at the police station. But if he isn't claimed in 10 days, we are back to where we started. I put my hand under the terrier's body and lifted him, limp and unresisting, into the crook of my arm. He liked people, this one, liked and trusted them. I could ask around the practice, of course, but nobody seems to want a dog when there's one to spare. I thought for a moment or two, maybe an advert in the local paper. Wait a minute. Pardon me. Wait a minute, said Helen. Talking about the paper, didn't I read something about an animal shelter last week? Placing those pups got me into contact with a lot of pet owners, and before I knew it, there was a happening. Everybody, wait a minute, what's going on here? Is there a page missing? Nope. I just skipped a page. Sorry, kids. One moment. Here we are. I looked at her uncomprehendingly. Then I remembered, that's right. Sister Rose from Topley Banks Hospital. They were interviewing her about the stray animals she had taken in. It would be worth a try. I replaced the terrier in Sam's basket. We'll keep this little chap today, and I'll ring Sister Rose when I'm finished work tonight. At tea time, I could see that things were getting out of hand. When I came in, the little dog was on Helen's knee, and it looked up as though he had been there for a long time. She was stroking his head and looking definitely broody. Not only that, but as I looked down at him, I could feel myself weakening. Little phrases were creeping unbidden into my mind. I wonder if we could find room for him. Not much extra trouble. Perhaps if we... I had to act quickly, or I was sunk. Reaching for the phone, I dialed the hospital number. They soon found Sister Rose. I listened to a cheerful, business-like voice. She didn't seem to find anything unusual in the situation. In the matter-of-fact way, she asked questions about the terrier's age, appearance, temperament, etc., gave me the impression that she had seen a lot of unwanted animals through her hands. I could hear the firm, penciling sounds as she took notes. Then she said, "Well, now, that sounds fine. He's the sort we can usually find a home for. When can you bring him along?" "Now," I replied. The misty look on Helen's eyes as I marched out with the dog under my arm told me I was only just in time. And as I drove along the road, I couldn't put away the thought that if things had been different, the future settled, and a proper home, this little brown creature rolling on his back in the passenger seat with his wide mouth half open and the friendly eyes fixed questioningly on mine would never have got away from me. Only when the occasional car flashed by did he spring upright, look from the window with the old despairing expression. Would he ever forget? Sister Louisa Rose was a rather handsome woman in her late 40s with a sort of healthy, smiling face I had imagined at the other end of the phone. She reached out and took the terrier from me with an eager gesture of an animal lover. "Oh, he looks rather dear, doesn't he?" she murmured. Behind her house, a modern bungalow in the open country near the hospital, she led me to a row of kennels with outside runs. Some of them housed single dogs, but there was other large ones with an assortment of mixed breeds, playing happily together on the grass. "I think we'll put him in here," she said. "It'll cheer him up. Quicker than anything, I'm sure. He'll mix in well." She opened the door in the wire netting around and pushed the little animal in. The other dogs surrounded him, and there was the usual ceremonious sniffing and leg cocking. Sister Rose cupped her chin with her hand and looked down thoughtfully through the wire. "A name. We must have a name. Let me see. No. Yes. Pip. We'll call him Pip." She looked at me with raised eyebrows, and I nodded vigorously. "Yes, definitely. That's just right. He looks like a Pip." She smiled impishly. "I think so too. But I've had a lot of practice, you know. I've become rather good at it." "I'll bet you have. I suppose you've named all this lot?" "Of course." She began to point them out one by one. "There's Bingo. He was badly neglected. And there's Fergus, just lost. That bigger retriever is Griff. He was a survivor of a car crash when his owners were killed. And Tessa, badly injured when she was thrown away from a fast-moving vehicle. Behind her over there is Sally Ann, who really started me in with the business of animal sheltering. She was found heavily pregnant, with her paws bleeding, so she must have run for many miles. I took her in and managed to find home for all the puppies. And she's still here. Placing those pups got me into contact with lots of pet owners, and before I knew what was happening, everybody had the idea I regularly took in stray animals. So I started, and you can see the result. I shall have to expand these premises soon." Pip didn't look so lonely now, and after the preliminary courtesies, he joined a group watching interestedly a fierce tug-of-war on a stick between a collie and a crossed Labrador. I laughed. "You know, I had no idea you had all these dogs. How long do you keep them?" "Till I can find a home for them. Some are only here for a day, others stay for weeks or months. And there are one or two like Sally Ann who seem to be permanent boarders now." "But how on earth do you feed them all? It must be an expensive business." She nodded and smiled. "Oh, I run dog shows. I run little dog shows, coffee mornings, raffles, jumble sales, anything. But whatever my efforts, I'm afraid the strays keep munching their way into the red. But I manage." She managed, I guessed, by dipping deeply into her own pocket. Around me, the abandoned, rejected dogs barked and ran around happily. I had often thought, when I encountered cruelty and neglect, that there was a whole army of people who did these unspeakable things, a great unheeding horde who never spared a thought for the feelings of the helpless creatures who depended on them. It was frightening in a way. But thank heavens there was another army ranged on the other side, an army who fought for the animals with everything they had, and with their energy, their time, their money. I looked at Sister Rose, at the steady eyes and the clear-skinned... Let me try that again. I looked at Sister Rose, at the steady eyes in the cleared-skinned, scrubbed nurse's face. I would have thought her profession of dedication to the human race would have filled her life utterly, with no room for anything else, but it was not so. I'm just going to have some water. I'm getting rather parched. "Well, I am very grateful to you, sister," I said. "I hope somebody will take Pip off your hands soon, and there's anything else you need that I can do, please let me know." She smiled. "Oh, don't worry. I have a feeling this little chap won't be here very long." Before leaving, I leaned on the wire and took another look at the border terrier. He seemed to be settling in all right. But every now and then, he stopped and looked up at me in those questioning eyes which pulled so hard. I had the nasty feeling that I, too, was letting him down. His owners, then me, then Sister Rose, all in a couple of days. I hoped it would work out for him. I found it difficult to get that dog out of my mind. I lasted only a week before dropping by in the animal shelter again. Sister Rose, in an old Macintosh and Wellingtons, was filling the feeding bowls in one of the kennels. She said, "You've come about Pip, I expect." Putting down her bucket. "Well, he went yesterday. I thought I'd have no trouble. A very nice couple called round. They wanted to give a home to a stray, and they picked him out straight away." She pushed the hair back from her forehead. "In fact, I've had a good week. I've found excellent homes for Griff and Fergus, too." Fine, that's great." I paused for a moment. I was wondering, about Pip. "Has he gone out of the district?" "Oh, no. He's right here in Derby. The people are called Plender... I'm going to try not butcher this, kids. Plenderleith? Yes. The people are called Plenderleith. He's a retired civil servant, quite high up, I believe, and he gave a generous donation to the centre, though I didn't expect one. They've bought one of those nice little houses at the Holton Road, and there's a lovely garden for Pip to play. I gave them your name, by the way, so no doubt they'll be coming round to see you." A wave of totally irrational pleasure swept over me. "Ah, well, I'm glad to hear that. I'll be able to see how he's getting on." I didn't have long to wait. It was less than a week later that I opened the waiting room door and saw an elderly couple sitting there with Pip on the end of a very new lead. He adopted his usual gambit of rolling onto his back as soon as he saw me, but this time there was no helpless appeal in his expression, but sheer joyous abandon, with the comical little face split across with a wide, panting grin. As I went through the ritual of chest rubbing, I noticed he was wearing a new collar, too. Expensive looking, with a shiny medallion bearing his name, address, and telephone number. I lifted him, and we all went through to the consulting room. "Well, now, what's the trouble?" I asked. "No trouble, really," the man replied. He was plump and pink-faced, grave eyes, and immaculate dark suit accorded perfectly with my idea of top civil servant. "I've recently acquired this animal, and should be grateful for your advice about him. By the way, my name is Plenderleith, and may I introduce my wife?" Mrs. Plenderleith was plump too, but it was a giggly plumpness. She didn't look such a solid citizen as her husband. "Firstly," he continued, "I should like to give him a thorough checkup." I had already done this, but went through it again. Though Pip made things difficult by rolling over every time I got the stethoscope on his chest. And as I took his temperature, I noticed that Mr. Plenderleith ran his hand repeatedly over the brown hair on the back, while his wife was looking over his shoulder, made encouraging noises, and nodded reassuringly at the little dog. "Absolutely sound in wind and limb," I pronounced as I finished. "Splendid," the man said. There was this little brown mark on his abdomen." A touch of anxiety showed in his eyes. Just a patch of pigment, nothing, I assure you." "Ah, yes, good. Mr. Plenderleith cleared his throat. "I have to confess, Mr. Herriot, that my wife and I have never owned an animal before. Now I believe in doing things thoroughly, so in order to give him proper care and attention, I have decided to study the matter. With this in view, I have purchased some books on the subject." He produced some shiny volumes from under his arm. "Care of the Dog in Sickness and Health, and finally, The Border Terrier." "Good idea," I replied. Normally, I would have shied away from the imposing battery, but in this case, I liked the way things were going. I had the growing conviction that Pip was on a good wicket here. "I have already gleaned a considerable amount from my reading," said Mr. Plenderleith, "and I believe it is desirable that he be inoculated against distemper. As you know, he is a stray, so there is no means of ascertaining whether it is not this." Oh. So there is no means of ascertaining whether or not this has been done. I nodded. Quite right. In fact, I was going to suggest that. I produced a vial of the vaccine and began to fill the syringe. Pip was much less concerned than his owners as I gently injected the contents under his skin. Mr. Plenderleath, his face rigid with apprehension, kept patting the dog's head, while his wife at the other end stroked the hind limb and adjured her pet to be brave. After I had put the syringe away, Mr. Plenderleath, visibly relieved, recommenced his investigations. Let me see now. He put on his spectacles, produced a gold pencil, and snapped up a leather-bound pad where I could see a long list of neatly written notes. I have 1 or 2 queries here. And then and he had indeed. He grilled me at length on feeding, housing, exercise, the relative values of wicker dog baskets and metal-framed beds, the salient features of common ailments, often referring to his shiny books. I have a note here concerning page 143, line 9. It says, I answered impatiently, leaning across the table. I had a waiting list of farm visits, including several fairly urgent jobs, but I listened with growing contentment. I had hoped for concerned and responsible persons to take this little animal over, and these people were right out of the blueprint. When at length Mr. Plenderleath had finished, he put away his notepad, pencil, and removed his spectacles with the firm, precise movements which seemed part of him. One of my reasons I desired a dog, Mr. Herriot, he went on, was to provide myself with exercise. Don't you think that is a good idea? It certainly is. One of the surest ways to keep fit is to own an attractive little animal like this. You simply have to take him out, and just think of all the lovely grassy tracks over the hills around here. On Sunday afternoons, when other people are lying asleep in their chairs under their newspapers, you'll be out there striding the fells, rain, hail, or snow. Mr. Plenderleath squared his shoulders, and his jaw jutted out, as though he already saw himself battling through a blizzard. I like this man. And another thing, his wife giggled, it'll take some of this off. And she thumped him irreverently on his bulging waistline. Yeah, I like them both. Now, my dear, he admonished her gravely, but I had seen the makings of a sheepish grin, which completely belied his stuffed shirt image. Mr. Plenderleath, I felt, was all right. He put his books under his arm and reached out for the little dog. Come, Pip. We mustn't delay Mr. Herriot any longer. But his wife was too quick for him. She gathered the terrier into her arms, and as we walked along the passage, she held the rough face against her own. Outside the surgery door, I saw them installed in a spotless little family saloon. And as they drove away, Mr. Plenderleath inclined his head gravely. His wife gave a gay wave, but Pip, hind legs on her knees, feet on the dashboard, gazing eagerly through the windscreen, was too busy and interested to look at me. As they rounded the corner, I had the impression of a little cycle coming to a happy end, and of course the main cog in the sequence of events had been Sister Rose. This was just one of the helpless creatures she had salvaged. Her animal shelter would grow and expand, and daily she would work harder without gain to herself. There were other people like her all over the country, other shelters, and I felt I had given a privileged glimpse. And I felt I had been given a privileged glimpse of that selfless army. I'm really losing my way here. And I felt I had been given a privileged glimpse of that selfless army which battled ceaselessly and untiringly on the side of a great throng of dependent animals. But right now, I was concerned only about one thing. Pip had come home for good. I was grateful for the opportunity to write about these two things. the abhorrent practice of dumping unwanted dogs, and the humanitarian work of Sister Rose and people like her. Those two armies have always been very real to me. The great throng of uncaring humans on one hand who do these despicable things, and the brave group of compassionate people on the other hand who devote their lives to the abandoned creatures. Sister Rose is still immersed in her great work, and there is now a Sister Rose branch of Jerry Green Dog Sanctuaries just outside our town. Every stray and rejected dog is taken in and cared for until a good home is found for it. The thousands of visitors who come to our surgery give generously to this cause, and I sign their books, and every penny goes to help the dogs. The good army is winning in Derby. And that is it, my children. I love you very much, and I hope you have a good rest of your weekend.